There we go. To be ready. So what do I need to do? Oh, I go 2, 1. Yeah, Dr. Douglas, we're ready.
All right, let's go. Well, a warm greeting to all of you again from the other side of the Potomac. I am in this series, as I said last week, talking about a particular phase in the development of Reformed Protestant political thought. It's the period in the 18th and the 19th centuries, a time after the dust had settled, so to speak, with respect to the Reformation. And people in the Reformed tradition who were in many cases, very self-consciously Reformed, part of that tradition, were responding to challenges which were different from the ones that had arisen at the time of the Reformation. I'm talking about 3 of those challenges in the course of this series. The first was revolution, which came on the scene in the late 18th and on into the 19th century like a whirlwind. And there was revolution after revolution after revolution after revolution across the face of the Western world. And that posed for Reformed Christians and others the question of how to respond to, and in some cases participate in, revolutionary politics. I talked last time particularly about the response to the American Revolution and the French Revolution. Today, my theme is democracy, and I'm going to be dividing these remarks into 3 parts. In the first part of my remarks, I'm going to talk about the meaning of democracy, and in particular, what differentiates modern understandings of democracy from earlier ones. In the second part of my remarks, I'll talk about the Reformed tradition and its, so shall we say, historic position on the issue of democratic participation in public life. And then in the final section of my remarks, I'm going to talk about a change which came over Reformed political thought in the aftermath of the American and French revolutions. Before I get into that, however, just a couple of preliminary observations. One is that this is a particularly salient time to be talking about this particular topic. I think this topic always has a certain resonance, particularly in the mind and thinking of Americans, but it has particular relevance in our own time because, to state the obvious, we're living through what appropriately has been characterized as a crisis of democracy, a crisis of democracy. And of course, that prompts you to think about, what does it mean to be a Democrat? What does it mean to be committed in any sort of principled way to democratic ideas? I want to say, just parenthetically, this could be the subject of a whole lecture, but it will just be a parenthesis here. I think characterizing the current crisis of democracy as a struggle between democracy and autocracy is a misleading characterization. I think it's better to think of this crisis as a struggle between 2 different ways of thinking about the democratic idea, one of which is sometimes called liberal. I prefer to call it constitutionalist, and the other is populist. There's a struggle going on in our country and many other countries between 2 different versions of democratic politics. And I think you will see as I speak this morning how much that is connected to the history I'm going to be going over. The second thing is just a personal observation. When I was at Georgetown, Catholic institution, of course, and I would encounter some young men and women, not I don't want to exaggerate the number, but some young men and women who were very interested in these themes of the relationship between religion and public life, ones I talk about so much here in this setting. And interestingly enough, when people would find out, I didn't make a big deal of sort of publicly announcing it, but when Roman Catholics in particular would find out that I wasn't one of them, that I was one of those protestants, as one of my colleagues used to say, one of those protestants, they oftentimes would ask me, usually in a conversation in my office, questions like the following. Well, what are you, what kind of Protestant are you? Well, I'm a Presbyterian. And then I would get this question sometimes. Especially among, shall we say, progressive Catholics who are very interested in the relationship between their faith and progressive ideas, as they would characterize them. They would say, are the Presbyterians Democrats? Do they believe in democracy? Is democracy part of their church? And I would say, yes, but it's complicated. Yes, but it's complicated. Keep that in mind as I speak here. Yes, but it's complicated. Now back to my main subject matter, which is,
Email.
first instance, the meaning of democracy.
Link to the project I'm working on today doesn't work in the bulletin.
Well, I can't talk if somebody's.
Yeah, we need you to mute yourselves. I should be muting everybody.
Are we set now?
We're all set.
All right. I'm going to use the word, I'm going to use the concept of democracy in a very simple and straightforward way. It means two things: political equality and popular sovereignty. That's the most general meaning that you can give to democracy, and that's the one on which I'm going to be operating this morning: political equality and popular sovereignty. Two things together: political equality and popular sovereignty. I'm sure all of you know what I mean by popular sovereignty, and that is that ultimately the people decide. Ultimately, the people. Of course, the obvious question is, who are the people? Long, complicated discussion, perhaps. We're not going to have it this morning. But who are the people? Popular sovereignty. It means that if there are governing elites, as there typically always are, people who are officials, who are elected to public office, that periodically they are accountable to the public. So that ultimately the public has a say, the popular, the people have a say in deciding who is going to be governing for a certain period of time. Usually it's oftentimes added that the say which the public has in deciding these matters comes about through fair and free elections. Very important. We're being reminded in our time of the importance of those ideas. Popular sovereignty, that ultimately the public decides, not somebody else, who's going to be governing. And then political equality means, and I'm choosing my words carefully here, one person, one vote. One person, one vote. Not some people 2 votes, not some people 5 votes, not some people having much greater influence than others. Democracy in its most basic sense means that there is an equality of political standing, not only with respect to voting, but also qualifications for office. The democratic idea arises, whenever it arises, as a rejection of various forms of elite rule. And when you think about the history of human governance, it's actually the case that for most human experience, the dominant forms of public life have been elitist. Monarchy, aristocracy, oligarchy, military rule, all kinds of different configurations of elite rule, contrary to democracy, and all of those in a form that is unaccountable. Monarchy, unaccountable. Aristocracy, unaccountable. Oligarchy, unaccountable. Military rulers, unaccountable. Democracy inserts into that a requirement that there be accountability. Now, I want to stress something which is oftentimes, I think, ignored to our at our expense, and that is the following. The idea of democracy is an old idea, indeed an ancient idea. I know most everybody in this room understands that, in a sense, it goes back to antiquity, even pre-Christian antiquity. And of course, we associate the idea of democracy most directly with the experience of one particular Greek city-state, Athens, which had this famous developed set of ideas around their experience, and that was a relatively brief experience, actually, of democratic rule in the city-state of Athens. And throughout subsequent history, there have been many different episodes in which a certain community, usually a small community, and I want to emphasize that, usually a small community, was able to establish in some reasonably stable form the thing I've been referring to earlier. That is, forms of governance that entailed political equality, or at least some version of political equality and popular sovereignty. But, and here comes one of my key points this morning. Prior to modern times, it was assumed that democracy was something which would work only in small, very small societies. Let me say that again. Prior to modernity, prior to the emergence of the modern nation state, it was assumed, just taken for granted by people who thought at all seriously about these matters, that democracy was something which would work, or anything like democracy was something that would work only in small places, like, for example, republics, the Italian republics or the Swiss republics, cantons, where you had a relatively small area geographically, but also a small population. And in that very limited setting, you could have a degree of democracy. But the assumption was, once you got beyond that, once you got something in the direction of a nation, let alone an empire, it was simply impractical. It was something that wouldn't work, and therefore needed to be excluded, marginalized from serious consideration. Now, one of the most important things that happens in the development of modern life and modern politics is that assumption is called into question. That assumption is called into question, and nowhere was it more dramatically called into question than in the emergence of the American Republic in the latter part of the 18th century. And so it's appropriate to think of the American experiment, and that's a good way to put it, especially from a European point of view, the American experiment as a kind of innovation in relation to this long history of skepticism about the possibility of ruling anything large in anything like a democratic way. Because as things have unfolded in the struggle, as I talked about it briefly last time, in the American struggle for independence, and then the formation of a republic, and a republic which had aspirations of being a stable republic, a lasting republic, as that developed, it became evident that this was a society, and it was, from the European point of view, a huge society, a sprawling society with all these colonies up and down the eastern part of North America. That these societies were somehow trying to forge something which would be a unified nation, and at the same time that there were at least some elements within the struggle for the independence and of that nation, that newly being constituted nation, and a government that would rule over it that had democratic elements. Now, at the time of the American founding, I want to stress, at the time of the American founding, the United States was at best democratic in aspiration. And I think the more accurate way to characterize it is to say, because, and it's a very interesting legacy which we live with today, questions about the franchise, who was going to get to vote, how the voting process was going to take place, was left largely to the states, the federal system. You had in many of the states, colonies emerging as states, you had in many of the states something which was barely democratic from our point of view. For the most part, I think it's fair to say that in the early years of the American Republic, the electorate, made up, of course, in slightly different ways in different states, it wasn't a federal issue. The electorate was made up of a minority of the population, and it was a minority of the white population. It certainly didn't include blacks. It was males, typically property owners, and oftentimes it was property owners of substantial quantities of property. Now, one of the things I'm going to be stressing this morning is that began to change within a couple of decades. That began to change in the history of the United States. And it began to change in particular in the early 1800s, the 19th century, with the emergence, especially in the 1820s and 30s, of that movement that we now characterize as Jacksonian democracy. Andrew Jackson, I have to say parenthetically, I don't think he was a very good Presbyterian, but Andrew Jackson was the first person who called himself a Presbyterian who was president of the United States. Andrew Jackson, who was very much the leader of, and I'll come back and talk about this term later, a populist movement. Because of the emergence of the Jacksonian movement, you had rather direct pull in the 1820s in the direction of what I've characterized as one of the key features of democracy: one person, one vote, political equality. I would argue, and I don't think this is an idiosyncratic view at all, this is just a kind of almost a given now in the historical writing on the subject. I would argue that the first truly democratic election in the United States, that is national election, was 1828. Let me say that again, 1828. By that time, you're getting something approximating one man, it's not women yet, to put it mildly, one man, one vote in most of the states. 1828, therefore, can be treated as a kind of point of departure for the kind of principled embrace of democracy in the United States. And by the way, as things were unfolding in Europe, you had one surge after another of people who were seeking an expansion of the franchise, an expansion of the number of people and the kind of people who could vote. And in every single case, I stress this to my students when we were talking about this historical period, in every single case, without exception, even in Britain, the effort to expand the franchise, to include larger numbers of people in the electorate, especially to include the working class in the electorate, the hoi polloi, as they were sometimes called, that met with stiff resistance. So you have a sort of series of revolts and revolutions, oftentimes involving violence, if not involving violence, a threat of violence. The key moments are 1830, 1848, 1860s, early 1870s. Again and again and again, there are these surges coming from, you might say, sort of the lower elements in society, demanding some political rights and representation. And over time, gradually, in some places, in other cases, as a result of insurrection, you begin to get a democratization in European politics. This whole idea of democracy was a source of agitation, of conflict, and of course, radicalism throughout much of European politics. And one of the things that differentiated the United States in that period, although the United States was entering into its period of civil war, which involved its own version of the struggle over democracy, one of the things that differentiated the United States, to the amazement, I might say, of many European observers, was that the nation seemed to be holding together in its commitment to democratic ideas and practices. All right, so that's the first part of what I want to say today. There's a history to democracy, an ancient idea which needed to be adapted to modern conditions. And by the way, the thing we now take for granted about it, I think maybe a little too casually, is that democracy, the democratic idea, can be adapted to the circumstances of a modern nation state, although it's very difficult because of the numbers of people involved and the complexity of keeping them connected well to one another. Now, what about the Reformed tradition? Part two of my remarks. What about the Reformed tradition? First, a generalization. I don't think it's appropriate to say that the Reformed tradition was unambiguously democratic at all. It was not, in fact, really democratic, but it had a sort of elements within it that pulled people in a democratic direction. Let me say that again. The Reformed tradition, going back to the 16th century, the time of the founding, the time of Zwingli and Calvin and Knox and so forth, it was not initially democratic in any unambiguous sense, but it had elements within it that pulled in that direction. And to illustrate that, I want to talk about a little bit about Geneva in the days of John Calvin. Keep in mind that he's a French emigre in a very peculiar situation. He is invited in the in the early 1540s to come to Geneva by the city fathers, the city council, to provide leadership for the Reformation. They're trying to make a Reformation there. And in a remarkable period of change, he presides as a person who never really was a Swiss citizen, citizen of Geneva, a sort of hired hand, if you will, in a remarkably sustained period running from 1541 all the way up to 1564, the time of his death. He is providing leadership for an ongoing reformation of religion and life in Geneva. Now, Geneva at that time was newly independent. It was newly independent. It had been a principality for a long time, excuse me, ruled over by various autocratic forces. But through a struggle for independence, which was linked to the Reformation in the 1520s and 30s, it achieved its autonomy, its independence, and it began to create institutions that were designed to make possible popular self-government. Let me say that again. Institutions that were designed to make possible this new thing from their point of view, cast off the prince, cast off the bishop who was his henchman, and rule ourselves, govern ourselves in this city-state, this canton of Geneva. And there was, in the period that Calvin was there, and I think this was one of his great assets, one of the things that he was able to rely upon, there was real pride among many Swiss, in many of the Swiss cantons, including Geneva, in the idea of autonomy and self-government and not being dominated by some elite. And Calvin himself, interestingly enough, he was a lawyer by training. I assume most of you know that. He was a lawyer. And by the way, if he had not experienced a conversion, as he did as a very young man in his 20s, turned his life around dramatically, if that had not happened, I think he probably would have ended up in his native France as a rather distinguished jurist or academic who taught the law, because he was a very well-trained, learned man in the law and was sort of moving in that direction when he was caught up in the ferment of the Reformation and became very quickly a refugee. That's another thing to know about John Calvin. He spent his whole life in exile, really a marked man, could not go back to France. And when he came to Geneva, especially in the early 1540s, he was invited by the city fathers, because of his legal experience, to help them draft constitutional documents which would enable them to have a lasting form of self-government. It's so interesting, a lasting form of self-government. And he did. He contributed as an outsider, as an advisor, so to speak, in the creation of these new institutions. And the new institutions have very much the look of democracy, very much the look of democracy. The town is run, much as we have come to think of civic government. The town is run by what's called a small council made up of 20 people. Think of it as kind of like a city council. And then there's a larger council of a couple of hundred people to which they are answerable on a periodic basis. And then there's a great assembly, which meets annually. And the great assembly elects the people who are on the two councils that govern the city. And Calvin very much believed in the idea of an elected leadership, He was very hostile to the idea of people having power in perpetuity without being accountable, without having to have their position in public office ratified by the public. So all of that sounds very democratic, and it is very democratic in a certain sense, except now for the following. Calvin, and he was not alone in this, believed that it was best for civic affairs to be handled by an elite. It was best for civic affairs to be handled by an elite. Indeed, in his writings, what he suggested was the following. There is among human beings a natural hierarchy. There is among human beings a natural hierarchy. And that hierarchy manifests itself in many ways. but the hierarchy that he had in mind in particular was a variety of different skills. Some people are just made to do that. Some people are made to do something else. Some people are made to do yet something else. And he would oftentimes in his sermonizing talk about this. Some of us are made to give lectures. Some of us are made to make laws. Some of us are made to do commerce, and a whole series of different things. And he said that's sort of in his mind the natural order. But within that, he said, there are in all of the different spheres of life, but particularly in public life and the church, there are people who, by virtue of the skills that they have been given, I think you would say by God, they are endowed with skills that just naturally set them apart to provide leadership. And they should be in positions of leadership. They should think of public life as a calling. He even says at one point in the Institutes, it is appropriate for people who are in positions of civil authority to think of public life as a calling, and that above all is the guarantee, or the more likely guarantee, he said, makes it more likely that they will govern well, that they will govern wisely, that they will govern morally, that they will be just and fair in their rulings, and so forth. The natural elite that Calvin had in mind was characterized by several different features. One was, of course, skills. They're just people who have skills that are appropriate for leadership in any given domain. Same thing in the military. They're just set apart by virtue of some skills they have. But in Calvin's mind, it was also education. He was, of course, an enormous believer in education. And he wanted to make education widely available in society. And his assumption was that people who did well in the world of education and became very well educated just naturally were the ones who should lead. And then, of course, he also believed, and really spoke a lot about this, in some cases very critically of current leaders. He said, if people do not behave in a trustworthy way, if they do not exhibit in their own lives upright character, then they disqualify themselves for positions of leadership. And the public, he said, should be responsive to that, and generally should preclude them from participating in public life. The other thing I want to stress about this is that all of these premises are built into our Presbyterian form of government, are built into it. And you may not know this, but the whole idea of elders and a session is a reflection of this way of thinking that I've just described. The session in his mind, the elders in his mind, who he thought should play a very active role in the leadership of the church, were a kind of elite, who would provide, by virtue of their skills and their knowledge and their spiritual qualities, they would provide appropriate leadership for the rest of the church. Ultimately, Calvin believed the following: that the best kind of regime, the best kind of political regime, whether in the civil realm or the ecclesiastical realm, that is, the church, was what he characterized as a mixed regime. And it's a very good term, because it has resonance not only with his thought, but with the history of political thought generally, going all the way back to the ancients. They oftentimes talked about the best regime being a mixture of two different kinds of things: elite leadership and popular participation. Let me say that again: elite leadership and popular participation. And if the relationship between those two things was worked out well, and he saw that as a kind of task of statecraft. If they were if the institutions were structured properly, so that they could relate to one another in a constructive way, you would have the ideal regime. The skills and excellence of elites, combined with the limits on them that would be placed by popular participation. One other thing, which he firmly believed in, and it's a very important part of Reformed thought generally, is an insistence upon, in various forms in the church and the civil realm as well, the rule of law. The rule of law, articulated in basically in constitutional principles, whether they're written down in a document or simply part of the traditions or customs of the society, so that what is done by people who are actually involved in public life, whether they be elites or the populace, is limited by certain clear guidelines, constitutional guidelines separating what is appropriate from what is inappropriate. So we have in the Reformed tradition what I would characterize as a sort of combination of aristocratic and democratic ideas, and as I say, in Calvin and others I could mention if there were time, the hope is that those two things can be melded together well, and so that you get the best of both worlds, the democratic world and the aristocratic world. Having said that, let me now move on to the third part of my remarks and what I have to say, and talk about a change which takes place in Reformed thinking, as well as the thinking of other people in this time, and that is from the late 18th century into the early 19th century. A change comes over the thinking of Reformed Christians and others about exactly what is the desirable political form. It happens because of the thing I talked about some moments ago, and that is the pressures for change from below. The pressures for change from below that emerge in the aftermath of both the American Revolution and the French Revolution, especially in the American case, under the aegis of, under the auspices of the movement that we now think of as Jacksonian democracy. I said earlier that in the beginning, the American Republic was not really democratic because it involved a lot of, and by the way, from the point of view of the Jacksonians, a lot of the elements of the American Constitution, the American constitutional system, were too aristocratic, were too elitist, and they were reacting against that. The thought that the system needed to be changed to some extent in order to democratize it more fully. Now, the changes that happened in the Reformed world in thinking about this matter, this whole matter of what exactly is our position with respect to popular participation in public life, the changes that took place were in part simply because of the political dynamics of the time. When you're living in the 1820s, and these Jacksonian forces are developing, and you're a pastor or an active Presbyterian or an active Congregationalist or whatever, you're certainly aware of, in the same way that we are aware of, the wider political world, and you're thinking in some cases in very practical terms about responding to it. So part of it is just people being caught up, as Reformed Christians are caught up in the dynamics of the moment. They begin thinking about this matter somewhat differently. But I want to suggest something else is inserted into this that even more dramatically causes some rethinking among Reformed Christians. And that is as a result of, or sort of a consequence of, the Second Great Awakening, the emergence of what came to be known as evangelicalism. Evangelicalism. The 1820s and the 1830s are another one of those great moments. There was a one earlier, before the time of the struggle for independence. We get another one in the period before the Civil War. One of these great awakenings. This is the Second Great Awakening, not the first one, but the Second Great Awakening, and the rise of a brand of Christianity that was already labeled in that period as evangelical, and it's come to be seen as one of the principal sources of what you and I today think of as evangelical Protestantism. It was overwhelmingly Protestant. In our own time, those lines have been blurred a bit. There are people who call themselves evangelical Catholics, but for the most part, evangelical Christianity is still very much a Protestant phenomenon, and certainly in the time that I'm talking about here, the 1820s and 30s, it not only was predominantly Protestant, it was anti-Catholic. It had a very strong anti-Catholic flavor to it. Now, one of the elements of evangelicalism was, it had several different components, but one of the elements of it was a strong current of what I think is appropriately characterized as populism. It had a populist quality. indeed a rather deliberately populist quality, in the sense that it was anti-elitist, and it involved a sort of active critique of the religious practices of many of the established churches, the Anglicans, the Lutherans, and to some extent Presbyterians as well. And that critique came from Protestant sources that were more populist in their very being, in their very identity. The ethos of Protestant evangelicalism then, and to some extent now, of course, is the following: revivals, camp meetings. Today it would be online, but camp meetings and revivals, and emotionally charged preaching. Emotionally charged preaching designed to do what? To produce conversions, to produce repentance, to produce transformed lives. One of the criticisms that evangelicals have made all along of more formal kinds of Christianity, including, I'm sure, the kind that is encountered in most Presbyterian churches today, is that it is far too formal. And it appeals insofar as it has a direct appeal to people. It is much more an appeal to the head rather than to the heart. So the evangelical thrust is to let's shake things up. Let's shake things up, loosen things up, get away from all this formality, rebel against the formalism of religion as we so often find it in church, and equally important, maybe even more important, this idea that the Bible is for every man. The Bible is for every man. The Bible should be made clear that the Bible is not just the property of those who are the learned, not just the property of those who can study the Bible in very highly formalized way, with learning all kinds of languages and studying the history of doctrine and so forth. The Bible is best understood, in fact, said many of the proponents of the Second Great Awakening, the Bible is best understood by the ordinary person who just opens the text up and moves into the text himself and reads for himself, reads for herself, and gets meaning in that way. Meaning and that, of course, was set over against a way of reading Scripture and thinking about Scripture, which depended upon formal learning and adherence to creeds and confessions. I hope you sense, as I say what I've just said, that running through this is something else which needs to be emphasized as well. And that is one of the characteristics of evangelicalism all along, despite the fact that it has produced, especially in our time, some very noted scholars, some very distinguished scholars, people who are kind of the embodiment of learning in a strong sense. Evangelicalism has tended historically to be very suspicious of expertise, very suspicious of expertise. It is egalitarian in the sense that there's a strong suggestion, especially coming from clergy who are themselves not very learned, there's a strong suggestion that the Bible is best learned, is best encountered, is best, the gospel is best experienced without all of the confusion, clutter that comes from complicated reasoning of the kind that we find in scholarly discourses. The other thing, of course, which links it to politics, is the fact that there is in Jacksonian democracy, Jacksonian democratic movements, and insistence that it doesn't require any particular expertise to govern well. The ordinary man, the man in the street, so to speak, Jackson kept making this point over and over again, sometimes does a better job than the person who has a lot of expertise. Now, these ideas, evangelical ideas, were very much a kind of a powerful current in the 1820s and the 1830s, affecting politics, caught up in politics at the same time. There was a symbiotic relationship to some extent between evangelical movements, which produced, by the way, new churches that were less formal. A good example in the Reformed world is the Disciples of Christ, the Christian church, which was a spin-off from people who were Presbyterians and Congregationalists and were resisting their formalism and moved in the direction of something that was less formal and in their minds more democratic. That was part of it, more democratic. Within the Presbyterian world itself, there's a fascinating figure, and I just want to call him up for your attention as I come to a conclusion here. One of the most important figures in the Second Great Awakening was a Presbyterian named Charles Finney, Finney. He was one of the most celebrated preachers of the 19th century. He was a Presbyterian, although he was a Presbyterian in constant tension with, and even to some extent conflict with, the Presbyterian world. Why? Well, because he was not a very well educated man. He was attracted to the Presbyterian Church when he grew up in New York State. Wanted to become an educated person, but for various reasons was prevented from doing so. And he eventually sought ordination. He eventually sought ordination as a clergyman in the Presbyterian Church and got that, but got it in a very curious way. Rather than going to college and going to seminary, he became a clergyman by virtue of a tutorial, which he was taught by a local pastor. He comes close to being self-taught theologically, which in Reformed terms is almost a contradiction in terms for clergy. But then he became one of the great inventors of these evangelical techniques, the camp meetings and the revivals and all. He became very effective in leading that kind of preaching, and became somebody who was very actively promoting within the Presbyterian world a more egalitarian and less formal approach to.
Oh, hi, Elizabeth. How are you today?
Good. What's going on?
We can't.
You can go on. This is something from within the church. I think that was,
We can't block them, Carol.
yeah, I should, it was just weird. I would continue. Yeah.
Well, I'm about done. So let me just wind up here by saying the following. Even though these ideas were very actively promoted by Finney and others, and have long been a kind of sort of oppositional current within the Reformed world and more specifically the Presbyterian world, they've always been resisted. These populist influences have always been resisted within the Presbyterian world for a couple of reasons. And see if these don't resonate with you. One is the kind of people who've been attracted to Reformed Protestant Christianity have always been, from the get-go, people who have had a great respect for education, and in turn, a great respect for an educated clergy. It's very much the sort of idea that we find in Calvin, that people, as much as possible, should be well educated, and as part of the division of labor, that our clergy should be people who are well trained in the things which are necessary for them to perform their ministerial tasks with expertise. The Presbyterian world is very much, the Reformed world is very much a world in which it's populated by people who have a very strong respect for expertise, including education. And the other thing, which has been characteristic of Reformed Christianity, which puts them in tension typically with populists, is a respect for the rule of law. A respect for the rule of law, whether it be in the civil realm, having to do with constitutional law, but also in the ecclesiastical realm. We have, of course, a book of order. We have a set of guidelines there for shaping the conduct of church life, and that is a product of a particular way of thinking about the way in which church life should be conducted. So there has been in the Reformed world, I would say, a resistance to populism, which is much more pronounced than it is in some other parts of the Protestant world. Well, let me stop there and take a couple, two or three of these questions in the chat, and then
We'll recognize the room.
and then we'll recognize the room. Let me just take a look here.
Carol, I have a question. Let me come back to the room.
Sure.
Well, let me just agree totally with Diane Whitaker, but also Diane Whitaker says democracy assumes an educated populace. The argument for a republic is that some are more educated and better able to represent the interests of people in reality and so forth. That is a good way of drawing the distinction. Democracy assumes an educated populace. Republic even more. If you're a Republican in your thinking, which is a sort of variant of democratic thinking, there's an insistence upon recognizing the value of superior education. But let me stress, democracy as certain people understand it assumes an educated populace. That, I would say, one of the things that's so striking about our own public life today is that I think that's a contested idea. I think there is more than a little thinking in our society which says, regardless of how much education you have, your views matter, and not only do they matter, but they can matter profoundly, and they maybe even should trump the ideas of people who have more education. So it's interestingly enough, that is in certain circles, probably the ones that you and I inhabit, that's taken for granted, the value of education, but it's not something which is uniform, has ever been uniformly the case among Democrats. It depends upon what kind of Democrat you are. Well, Steve Fox raises a fascinating question. I think perhaps the assumption that democracy would work only in small communities changed with the advent of mass communication in the form of the printing press. That made public debate possible upon distances greater than the span of face-to-face meetings. I would say it was not so much the printing press, it was the electronic media which had that effect. And by the way, I think that point, which is a very well taken point, is an opening for a large conversation. What really is the desirable form of communication in the public realm? I think the ideal, which democratic theorists all along, going all the way from into the 20th century with people like Dewey and John Rawls and so forth, what they've always had in mind was a kind of conversation which was real conversation, that is back and forth, listening to the other, or what sometimes is characterized as dialogue. What goes on very often in the public realm today, to state the obvious, is not exactly dialogue. It's simply people, oftentimes polemically, stating positions over against one another. The people who have long praised the idea of civil discourse have in mind something which could be possible, I think, with the advent of electronic media, but all too often is not really realized that way. What you have in the communication that goes on with electronic media is a combination of two things: manipulation and polemics. Manipulation and polemics. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I think the ethics of communication today has become such a very important topic. I think we're still struggling with what exactly, not only to make of the ethical issues which are in play there, but also operationally to pursue the things which we desire. But my view is that the emergence of electronic communications, going back to the 20th century, even radio, television, and so forth, has fundamentally altered the way in which public discourse takes place. And more, we're sort of living out the consequences of that. It opens up a conversation which I can just sort of note as an issue that needs to be pursued. Now, I can go on here, but
we have two other people who raised their hands.
Exactly. Let's go to a couple from the floor.
First, Jack Bennett, who's here in the room.
I would like you to comment on what the Reformed tradition has to say about the following issue. In modern Christian democratic society, is it okay to judge the governments as to whether or not we think they're fulfilling the needs and will of God? And if so, we would confer respectability on a government that does that. And I'll go back to Samuel conferring on Saul, the first of the long line of monarchs in Israel. He said, this is not only a good idea to fight the Philistines, this is okay with God. And then we go back to the 18th, 19th century monarchs being crowned, having the crown put on their head by the religious leaders of the day. And although we don't have a king, we have our presidents swear the oath with the hand of the Bible, which could be interpreted as saying, the way I'm going to government is going to be okay with God. We have the Christian nationalists say, we need the government to be okay with God. So what does the Reformed tradition say about conferring respectability and judgment on the government as whether or not they think they're ruling by the will of God?
Well, there are actually 2 or 3 issues there. Let me briefly comment on 2 of them. From the get-go, in the Reformed tradition, there has been the assumption that through the study of Scripture, you can get a reasonably good idea of what God intends public life to be. Rooted in Scripture, reading Scripture well, you can get a pretty good idea of what public life ought to be, how rulers ought to conduct themselves, what in broad outline should be their goals in the framing and execution of public policy, etc. Now, over time, people have read the Bible somewhat differently, of course, but they've never departed from that premise. So, to your first question, is it appropriate in the Reformed tradition to look upon government and make a judgment as to its virtue or lack of virtue thereof on the basis of your understanding of Scripture? The answer is yes, of course. And I would say that's the most recent, the most current thinking on this topic conforms to the thinking that was present at the beginning. That's one question. And it says, how else would we think as Christians? But what to, in the light of Scripture, look at what is going on in public life and try to make sense of what we think is the thing that God would want us to affirm and pursue. The tricky part now, it seems to me, has to do with something which really didn't become really clear in people's minds until the latter part of the 20th century. Because up to the middle of the 20th century, there still was the idea that if you were operating on the premise I just said, then the thing that you should do is, as much as possible, is take control of public life as a Christian and try as much as possible to dominate public life. That was the operative assumption. I would say, keep in mind Protestants thinking about the possibility of a Catholic becoming president. You know, I'm as many of the people in this call are, I'm old enough to remember that. And I remember this very stout resistance on the part of Protestants to a Catholic president. Why? Because in their minds, that was something that was contrary to the will of God. Now, I want to suggest that something important has happened in the last roughly half century. And that is, we have become sensitive to the relationship between religious pluralism and democratic politics in a new way. And that requires us, it seems to me, not just to be tolerant of the views of people who are of other faiths, but in fact, to be respectful of their views and to resist, therefore, the impulse to want to dominate public life at least in a narrowly confessional way. That is, to take control of public life and dominate it for specifically Christian purposes, as opposed to what? Purposes which can be shared by people from other faiths. Now, my sense is right now is that the cutting edge of Reformed thought on this topic is precisely movement in the direction which is profoundly antagonistic to Christian nationalism, moving in the direction of saying respect for religious diversity is desirable. And some would even go so far as to say respect for religious diversity is God's will.
You can use your Christian ideals to judge the government, but what you do with that judgment is an entirely separate matter. I agree.
I totally agree with that. Totally agree with that. But I hope you see the second part of this is every bit as important as the first bit. Thank you. Good question.
Yeah.
Good question.
Michael Gibson, Michael Gibson had raised his hand.
Yeah, uh, uh, I just wanted to say I'm so enjoying this, but all of this discussion about tolerance of other views is very interesting. I'm reminded that Voltaire owned an estate at Ferney that was half in Switzerland and half in France, and he said that whenever the the Catholics in France would be upset with him, he would move over to the part of his estate that was in Switzerland. And whenever the Calvinists would do something that would basically put a death warrant out on him, he would move over to the French side. And but it is interesting. I mean, whether it's constitutionalism or whether it is populism, it doesn't neither one necessarily makes provision for that tolerance. I think you were talking about religious pluralism a minute ago, but I was struck by a piece that just appeared yesterday about a suburb of Detroit called Hamtramck, that where a bunch of people had always welcome people from other parts of the world. Well, they had welcomed some refugees from the Middle East, and the Middle East folks now are a majority in the community, and they basically outlawed the having a gay pride flag out in the community. So it's really strange. No matter where you go, it's going to be hard to find religious pluralism acceptable.
Well, let me just comment on that last point that you make. It's such a fascinating twist in the development of the topic. It seems to me just the beginning of a good conversation about this is the recognition of the value of respecting the religious other. That's just the beginning. Because the religious other isn't going to say, what Muslim, Hindu, whatever, is going to say things which are objectionable to me. Objectionable to me, you might say, on moral grounds, like perhaps what you were suggesting. And it seems to me that the next step, therefore, in this conversation is, what do we do as different faith communities when we encounter a situation in which there are profound moral differences among us? What is the respectful things to do in dealing with that challenge? And by the way, I think there really is serious good work being done on this, and not just by theologians. I would say there are people of faith, particularly I would say some people working in the field of constitutional law, where there's some very good conversations going on about this. It's not an accident that we don't have. It's no criticism to say we haven't quite got the full answers to this yet. This is a new chapter in the unfolding of our own tradition as well as others.
I want to thank you so much. Unless you see something you really do want to comment on, I have a couple of things, but I think this will be going into next week. There's so much. This is such a rich discussion. I'm looking at the tension between individual rights, the rights of the individual versus that of the common good, or what is revealed in scripture, how we want to interpret that. And then look at the tyranny of the minority. All kinds of rich questions that we have here, but I'll give you the last word, Bruce.
Well, let me just say, I see John Gaffney's comment here, and I just want to make a quick comment about it. We have representative government, he says, not direct rule by the people. Well, absolutely. New England towns have meetings where everyone can vote. I think one of the great challenges of our time is that the institutions of representative government at the federal level, at the national level, are oftentimes very loosely connected, at best, to the institutions that embody the popular will at lower levels. That's a particularly American problem because of the way in which our federal government operates. but it's not just a federal problem, not just an American problem. Think of, for example, the European Union, which is struggling with its own version of the American problem. And some people have said the more this thing plays out in globalization, having to do with the immigrant issues that arise out of that, and the difficulty that the European Union is having in dealing with those problems, and our own federal government is having difficulty in dealing with those problems, that this is illustrative of the fact that even though the old wisdom that democracy was something that was effectively possible only in relatively small communities had been superseded, we may now see once again the difficulties in a very striking way, the difficulties of adapting the democratic idea to these large units, such as the United States has become. 300+ million people spread out in this very complex way, the European Union with all of those different components. And the old issue with which I started, is democracy something that really works for large units, is once again, I think, in play. Let me stop.
Wow, well, I can't thank you enough. We'll be looking at the implications of how that works among other nations with the issue of nationalism next week. And I did want to add that Adult Ed has a number of very provocative programs in October. Among them, we're looking at electronic communication and the influence that it has on we as believers, as followers of the faith. So stay tuned, but you've given us a lot to deal with and to think about for our last session with you, Dr. Douglas. Thank you.
All right. Have a good week.
Yes, you
All right.
too. Thanks.
Thank you.
And how much we need to be willing to